How can you record your podcast interview from anywhere in the world? Well, it actually does not have to be that challenging. I record my podcast interviews typically from my office space in New York, and a lot of the guests that I talk to, or pretty much all the guests that I talk to, I should say, are going to be located outside New York. Some of them might be in the UK, Australia, Canada, Mexico, all these different countries and continents around the world. And with that said, the way that you want to be able to connect with a remote podcast guest is there's a couple different platforms that you can use. You can use Zoom, and I've used Zoom, and I've also used another platform called Riverside. I found that overall I preferred Riverside over Zoom. Some people prefer Zoom over Riverside, and basically through using Zoom, you can get basically a link, and that person is going to click on the link, and that's how they join your podcast interview. And it's through that link that you can conduct this podcast interview from anywhere in the world. And like I mentioned, I'm in New York. I can talk to anyone in the US or outside the US just by giving them this Zoom link. I typically recommend that if you're using Zoom, you purchase, I believe it's like the business plan. It's going to run you about 150 bucks for the year. You can use the free version, but what I don't like about the free version is, as far as I remember, is that once you hit 40 minutes, the meeting automatically stops. So if you're in a podcast interview, you're wrapping up, or maybe it's a really good podcast interview, you hit the 40-minute mark, well, Zoom's automatically going to end. On Riverside, I pay the same amount. I believe it's like 150-ish per year to use Riverside, maybe a little bit more than that on that platform. But I like that platform. I find that the quality overall is better. It's better for me as a podcast host, but very similar to Zoom. You're going to get a podcast link, and that link is going to allow the guest to hop on your podcast interview from there. So on Riverside, I just say I use Calendly, and through Calendly, people can book an interview with me, and using Calendly, they're going to get an email with a link to the podcast interview. They're going to click on that link on the day that the podcast interview is scheduled to happen, and then they're going to show up and we're going to conduct the podcast interview. There's going to be a record button. You just make sure you hit that record button as you're hopping into the interview. It's really as simple as that. The other biggest thing that I'd probably recommend is just making sure that they have a good internet connection, whether it's you, the podcast host, or whether it's them as the podcast guest. Make sure they're in a nice, quiet environment. Make sure they have a good quality podcast microphone. But yeah, it really doesn't have to be that complicated to interview a remote guest from anywhere in the world. You can bring your podcast mic with you, which is really nice. I use a Blue Yeti mic. I find that one works best for me. You can have a Blue Yeti mic. You can buy a webcam. The webcam I bought was fairly expensive on Amazon. It was about like 30 bucks and does a very good, high quality job. And really, if you have a laptop, you have a good internet connection, you have a podcast mic, you can have a webcam. You don't need to have a webcam, but I recommend it. But bare bones, just a computer, a podcast mic, and an internet connection. You're using a Zoom or a Riverside as well. You can conduct your podcast interviews from anywhere in the world. And I hope that was really helpful for you. It doesn't have to be complicated. You can really do these remote interviews from really anywhere that you are.